we would like to thank and acknowledge our sponsors, DC3 Dreams and Boyce Astro. DC3 Dreams provides high-end observatory automation and web-based multi-user remote imaging. The AAVSO Net Observatories use DC3 Dreams ACP Expert for the Bright Star monitors and other programs. The AAVSO Photometric Call Sky Survey project, also known as APAS, has used ACP Expert's AI scheduler to automatically acquire over 500,000 star fields, hands-off, at a rate of 1,000 square degrees per night. This has resulted in photometry for over 128 million objects in about 99% of the sky. The Boyce Research Initiative and Education Foundation provides online astronomy education, observatory resources, and research experiences to students, student teams, and schools in order to learn how to perform observations, conduct research, and publish their results in scientific journals, such as the Journal of the AAVSO. Please check out their webpage to learn more about their work. All right, now, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I am proud to announce that your instructor this afternoon will be none other than Richard Berry. If you have been an amateur astronomer for any time at all, you probably recognize his name, as he's one of the more famous astronomers out there, and for good reason. Mr. Berry has been leading the way in telescope making and imaging for 60 years now, and has authored several books, including Krieg and Berry's The Dobsonian Telescope, which is still, 36 years later, the singular most highly recommended book in its field. And as an aside, I've actually got one of his books on my shelf right now. Fortunately for us, Mr. Berry's construction skills are not just limited to telescopes. He has built a variety of observatories in the past and is currently in the process of building yet another for his new house, making him just about as much of an expert as you can be on small observatory construction. We're very lucky to have him here with us today to share his knowledge and experience. Mr. Berry, you can take it from here.
Thank you, Lauren. And I'd like to say hi to many of my friends who I noticed in the participants list. So it's fun to do this. I was thinking about this the other day and realized that I have now built like 6 or 7 observatories, and I've always built very simple observatories. And that's what I'm going to focus on today. I'm not going to talk about a nice dome that everybody wants to have. I'm going to talk about that first observatory you have when you realize that you really are tired of taking the telescope outside and putting it on the grass. And at the end of the evening, taking it down again. So I will be addressing beginners. Now, we've got a lot of people who are very experienced, and feel free to put in your 2 cents in the Q&A, because one of the things that I always looked for as an audience, or as an editor when I was working for astronomy or doing telescope making magazine, is look for ideas that are good and then steal them. Now, people say, wait a minute, steal ideas? Of course. That's what it's all about. That's how we learn to do things. You see somebody doing something good, and you take that idea and then modify it and incorporate it into your own work. So let's get on with the presentation. I will do the share screen thing. Share, and then come on, start the show from the beginning. Here we go. My theme in talking about first observatories is keep it simple. If you desire to have a fancy observatory, let's see, spacebar. This is what everybody wants, right? Ever since the 1600s, we've wanted to make the biggest observatory, the best observatory. And when your telescope's 40 feet long, I have to keep it outside. Here we are. This is Christian Huygens in Holland, obviously, from the windmill. Looking through a long telescope suspended by a rope, a capstan to raise and lower it, and a little back end. This is how we used to do things. We don't do that anymore. So what I'm going to do is say, before you think about an observatory, start out with an observing station, because you have to figure out where you're going to observe from. And you're going to take into account where the trees are. And if you have a place in a suburban neighborhood, you got trees, almost certainly. Where are the street lights? You're going to want to be able to route electric power out to your telescope unless you're doing purely non-electronic observing of any kind, including, drive motors and stuff like that. And the first thing you want to do is you want to put something solid in the ground that says, this is where I observe from, because I've chosen a place. You may spend a few days or weeks moving around, finding the good spots, and you might want to designate 2 of them or 3 of them. Here's where I can observe the southern sky. Here's where I can observe things rising in the east. But sooner or later, if you're talking about more a fancier piece of equipment, you're going to be forced to pretty much choose a single spot. And I've just been through that process, walking around the backyard. And I found the spot that gives me a good southern horizon, pretty good in the east, and completely blocked in parts of the west by a very large spruce tree. So that's the trade-offs you have to make. And you're going to want to, as you begin to realize it gets cold sitting out there. Well, you already know that, right? That's why you want an observatory. So, and I will suggest some stuff with pictures. And you have to consider things like, can I just leave the mount outside and carry the optics out? Can I throw a tarp over it? So let's look at observing stations. This is my first observing station. August 9th, 1961, my friend and I would set up. This was a rock in our backyard. You can see trees. My friend had a Dynoscope RV6. I had a telescope that I had built myself, and I had not yet at that time finished the mount for it. So I observed by balancing the telescope with one of my brother's stilts on a kitchen stool, and we had electricity in the form of a little light so we could read our star maps. That became my observing station, the place where I observed from. Now, if you've got a typical backyard, and this is the kind of thing I'm back to doing like for the 6th or 7th time again, you need something solid in the ground. Put down some paving stones. Use whatever you want to do. They sell very nice 12-inch square stones, 2 inches thick. You can get 3 of those, dig them into the grass, water them in, and your telescope will sit nice and solid and level. That means you can bring the telescope out, set it up, and you don't have to make a new hole in the ground each time you observe. Here's another guy who's done a very nice job with this kind of thing. Get something solid in the ground. He's clearly chosen a spot. Great horizons there. Now, at some point you realize that the wind is chilly and you feel the wind chill factor. You can buy at very reasonable prices what it's called privacy fencing. These panels are typically 6 feet long, 7 feet high, and you can get them in all kinds of different materials. If you have a backyard, if your spouse objects to something ugly in plastic, you can find nice wood and stuff like that. And all you have to do is to make an L-shaped structure, and then you can put a table and a chair, and you can bring electricity out to that location. And electricity is very handy for running clock drives and small lights and all the other stuff that makes observing efficient, right? You don't want to keep dropping your eyepieces in the grass. You'd like the table, you'd like the place for your light, your star charts to be. Your observing location is, or your observing space is going to give you that. Now, ultimately, you're going to want to evolve that to some kind of observing shelter. That gives you protection from the weather. At this point, it depends crucially on where you live. Security. When I've lived out in the country, I haven't worried about security. I figure that something that looks like a chicken coop sitting out in the middle of a pasture, no one's ever going to bother it. And you know, if somebody figures out that there's a telescope in there, you just have to hope that they're an honest person and leave it alone. If you live in a city or a place where you don't have physical security, an observing shelter gives you maybe some kind of protection for your stuff. You can get electricity, you can get lighting, you can get internet available for your computer. The best thing about a shelter is that you can open it up and you can begin to observe right away. And the other thing is it gives you the possibility of having remote operation. That is, you can tie your telescope to your computer. You've got the internet link. You can go inside and you can observe from a warm place. If you're a visual observer, of course, you're going to be there at the telescope. If you're using CCDs or CMOS or something like that, and you have a go-to scope with computer control, then you can go remote. And it was only in the last 4 or 5 years that I managed to set up and work with remote stuff. And I loved it, absolutely loved it, because you open up the shelter as soon as it's dark. You set up the telescope, make sure that everything is, all the switches are turned on. You go back into the house, you log on to your system, and you can be working all night long. And as the dawn sky begins to get bright, you go out, you turn off the power switches, you roll the shelter back on, and bingo, it's all closed up and ready for the next night. Now, this is what happens when you don't have an observing shelter. This is what my system looked like back in the 1970s, I guess. It's a cross-axis telescope mount. There's an astro camera on it with 4x5 glass plates. I've got a bunch of other things running, and we had a 300-foot wire that ran up to an electric outlet on the back of one of my friend's houses. And I observed by bringing the telescope and the cameras for each observing session, and I left the mount out there covered with a tarp. That's great, but now you're talking about 45 to 60 minutes minimum setup time every time you observe. Of course, you're always polar aligned if you got the telescope out there, but it's not convenient. Here's what that rock in my backyard did within a few months. I built an English yoke. This is like the 100-inch telescope on Mount Wilson. Put my telescope in it, and that's how I observed for quite some time. This little mount, by the way, had a handy feature. There was a light here and a little thing so that I could keep my notes and observations on 3x5-inch note cards, and a little light so that I could It's those little things that make it easy, make it easy and efficient to do observing. Well, before long, as a telescope maker, I had to have a better scope than a 6-inch f7. And so I ground an 8-inch f10 mirror. And it was the best piece of optics I've ever made. The mirror was beautifully smooth, gave fantastic images, and it's mounted in a plywood tube. Now, this is now too big and too clumsy to cover with a tarp. So what do you do? Well, a friend of my father's who had a farm had a chicken coop that he had torn down. And he said, well, I can let you have some corrugated aluminum panels if you'd like them. So we got some scrap wood, we put tracks in the ground, got some wheels, and we made a roll-off A-frame. So this whole observing shelter rolls over the telescope. Now, a shelter like this is very crude, very simple carpentry. The biggest problem is you live in a place where you care about what your neighbors think. You know, an old chicken coop may be a little bit too crude, but you can do a nicer job physically if you want to. This guy has done a much nicer job. It's the same idea. He's put pebbles on the ground so he can work around the telescope. He's got his observing steps or ladder, and he opens up the 2 doors, rolls the building on, closes the doors, and bingo. Next night when he wants to observe, does the reverse, the telescope's out in the open. It's working great. This was, I think, observatory number 4. This is the one I had, let's see, when we lived in Wisconsin, I guess. This is now a 12-inch telescope. Notice I keep going for those English oak type mounts because they're very solid and very easy to build out of wood. And so this is a 12-inch f7 Newtonian with a square tube. I'm doing astrophotography. You can see there's a camera at the focus. And this was a 6-inch telescope that I was also doing photography with. It has the advantage that you can be up and observing within 2 or 3 minutes after rolling the building off, taking the shelter off. And you can store things like your observing ladders in the shelter. And so all you carry out to the eyepiece is your observing notebook, the eyepieces themselves in a little container, and bingo, you're in business. Now, some years later, this is another roll-off building that I built. This is not a very good picture because it was taken at night. For the 2017 solar eclipse, we were going to do an experiment. We were going to measure the gravitational deflection of starlight around the sun. We started that project somewhat too late to do a good job, but I had built a little roll-off shelter for a different purpose. And we turned it into the Eddington Einstein Observatory. And we had electricity. We had a thing with the computer. We had the telescope, which was a Genesis refractor, Teleview Genesis, the mount. And this rig in this form sat out there in the weather, untouched, for about 18 months. From the beginning of our testing and measuring star fields to the final photographs to determine the accurate astrometry of the reference fields. And we could be out there, roll it back, turn on the power, and be in business in about 5 minutes. So your observing shelter is the next step, often, because an observing shelter begins to teach you what you really need in a real observatory. Once again, it's going to protect your equipment from the weather, but A real observatory lets you observe and be, as they say, snug as a bug in a rug. You don't have the wind anymore. You've got handy work surfaces that are permanent, always there. You can observe for a long period of time instead of, I've reached my tolerance, I can't feel my fingers anymore. And you can, again, open up and begin observing rapidly. So I went out on the internet, I searched for very modest observatories. These are the kinds of things that people can build in a couple, maybe a month of work. And, accepting for the fact that lumber is currently quite expensive, the price is still low. This is like 6 sheets of plywood and a bunch of boards. And a building like this is great. This guy can roll the roof off, rolls off to the side, go in, and he's in business, within minutes of getting there. Here's a variation, very similar. And as I began to look at what different people have done, I realized, one of the best things you can do, and let me go back to this, whoops. He's simplified the building by having a single slant roof. There's no seam in the middle. There's no peak. If you build things, you discover that the seam at the top always leaks, no matter what you do. Now there's a problem that gravity wants to open it, so that says, well, keep it simple. Make the roof lightweight. Don't make a heavy roof. And so here's what you get. Okay, you can see the edge of a roof. You can see wood. And you can realize I could walk into this picture, set myself down on the seat, and be at the computer observing, or at the eyepiece observing in just a few minutes. It's beautiful. So you can have your charts there from the AAVSO, and you can be coming in, looking, making your comps, and recording it. It's so great to be able to sit in the little building, snug as a bug, and keep working. And we're now talking about a space that is roughly 8 feet square. It's about as small as you can get. And I would recommend that, at least for a start, you think in terms of about an 8-foot square as your starting size of your observatory. As soon as you start to get it bigger, it gets complicated and it stops being simple and something that you can build easily. Now, this is a little building that I built when we lived in Wisconsin. You can tell that it was designed for weather. And it's sitting on an 8-foot square base. The building itself is built from 4 sheets of plywood, and it doesn't have a conventional roof. Keep it simple. It's got a blue tarp. It's got bungee cords, and you can, depending on how you want to do your observing, you can flip back and expose any part of the sky you want, and yet keep the wind off of you. It's easier than a dome slot. Now you say, well, wait a minute, that tarp is going to wear out. I know, but a tarp costs $10 and you can buy a new one every 6 months. And when you get a lot of snow on the top of it, you go inside and you go bang, 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 pound it, and the snow slides off. Now, you'll notice that the walls here are only 4 feet high. A lot of observatories that people build, the walls are about 7 feet high. And the reason I think people do that is that they want to have the walls high enough to keep out the neighbor's lights. Okay, this is light pollution. That it becomes one of your design decisions. How high should the walls be? What I did was I made the walls 4 feet high, and then I built fold down panels. This wall here folds down so that I can observe to the east. This wall folds down to observe to the west, and the big panel on the back folds down so I can observe north. It takes just a short length of time to do that. And here I am in the observatory. Those of you who've been around in astronomy for a while recognize, oh, that's a cookbook camera. This is that was a build-it-yourself camera back in the old days. And here is that same old Genesis refractor that I used many, many years later. Just looking at the pictures, you realize, oh, that's an old style 1024 by 768 monitor. And yes, when I observed, I carried out a mini tower PC. And to make that easy to do, I took a conventional PC and I put a handle on the top so that I could carry it easily. All of that equipment stayed out in the observatory all the time, excepting the computer. Because on a cold night, the only way to get the computer to run was you turn it on inside the house, let it run for half an hour, turn it off, carry it outside, turn it on again immediately. If you don't do that, the hard drive won't start spinning, or it will start like whir, 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 whir before it runs up to speed. Well, with solid state drives, you don't have to worry about that anymore. But you'll notice I'm down low, I'm out of the wind, I have my workstation. This is what makes observing in 4 to 6 hour long sessions possible and fun. Another friend of mine, this guy built a much more expansive observatory. You can see that he's in the bottom of the valley surrounded by trees. But that didn't stop him from building a very nice 16 by 20 foot building. He's got an 18-inch telescope. I think it's f7, real long focal length. He does a lot of planetary stuff. And the roof is a pipe construction covered with plastic. So, you know, he has to renew the plastic every 2 or 3 years. But hey, you know, that's the price of having an observatory that doesn't cost a bundle and works really well. And this, by the way, is his internet connection. Now, I will mention later, if I haven't mentioned it already, that when you build an observatory, there's a number of things you want to do to keep it simple. First of all, check out the zoning laws. Okay, zoning laws specify how many square feet a building can be before you have to apply for a building permit. And as soon as you have to apply for a building permit, you have to build it the right way. Okay. If you build a temporary structure, in most municipalities, it goes under the zoning requirements, which is great because you no longer have to do anything the right way. Well, not quite, but okay. First key thing is don't put a concrete slab on the ground. Concrete slab gets hot, holds heat, and you're going to have convection all night long. Second, raise the floor of the observing floor, get it at least 12 inches off the ground. The reason is not that you want to be up high, but rather you want air to flow between the ground surface, which is always moist, and your observing floor, because you want the observing floor to stay dry. Because one of the biggest problems you have in a small observatory, once you close the building, and I'm going to say airflow, airflow, and airflow. Once you close the building, water comes up out of the ground. It condenses on things. And at night, when you observe, the building gets cold. When you close up the building and the day gets warm, first of all, you get condensation on everything. Everything gets wet. So get off the ground. You can build a nice wooden floor. You can put the building up on concrete blocks. You can put posts in, all sorts of ways to raise a small building off the ground, and not and avoid that concrete slab. Lots and lots of airflow. So you're going to want to put vents into your building so that air goes in and out a lot. And I will show you a picture of an observatory that I built, where I lived in Oregon, where it's always wet. It rains a lot. And even in the middle of winter, when it's raining all the time, my observatory was always dry inside. Because even when it's cold, flowing air will allow water and moisture to evaporate. Tilted flat roofs don't leak anywhere near as much as roofs with peaks. So I will illustrate that. This is a couple of guys who I've been working together to build. I think each of them built an observatory. And they are doing, when I saw this, I said, these guys are doing things right. I really like what they're doing. First of all, the observing floor is off the ground. So he's got airflow underneath here. His building is going to stay dry. Now, the little observatory I showed you before, that was too close to the ground. It was about a 4-inch gap around the edges. And what happened was that a family of skunks moved in. And Mama Skunk had 4 baby skunks. And every time I'd go out and sit in the observatory, I knew there was a skunk nearby because it was right under the floor. And they would make little squeaking noises. And the thing that I worried about was, am I going to climb out of the observatory and step on a skunk? Okay, so here you got the airflow and no space for skunks. This guy has put in a concrete pier, which is fine, and it's decoupled from the building. That's fine. He's used a tilted roof, and there's pictures of the roof later on. The building is very lightly constructed. This is not a fancy insulated wall. The reason you want to do that is when it cools down at night, the building doesn't stay warm, and the building is not full of warm convecting air going out through your light path to your telescope. So here's the view from the back side. You can see that there's been probably considerable thought as to where to put the building relative to the trees, the house, access to electricity, and so forth. And you can see construction is really, really simple. An observatory does not have to be built to the same standards as an habitable building. This is undoubtedly classed as a temporary structure. You want the roof, or if you have a roll-off structure building, the best solution people seem to have found is V tracks made out of metal and V rollers. A company called ALEKO sells them, and they're pretty cheap for the price, or rather for the purpose. these are sold for gates that open up automatically, but you can repurpose them and make them for observatory roofs. So here's what it looks like up close. You've got the track, and you've got the V panel, and then the roof is rolling on it. You can see that the roof structure is just two 2x4s at right angles. The other thing that you want to do is you don't want your observatory to be dark inside. Okay, you say, well, why would you do that? Well, insects love dark places during the daytime. Right? They can go in there, they can breed, they can hang out. They're harder for competitor uh, 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 um, predators to find them. Suntuf polycarbonate roof panels in white work really, really well. They're lightweight, they're inexpensive. They come in different lengths. 12 feet long is more than enough to cover an 8-foot by 8-foot building. And you just basically put them in with waterproof screws. The sun shines on this, and about 90% of the light reflects right off. So the amount of light that's going to come through, and then they absorb some light. So about 5% of the light actually comes through to illuminate your observatory. When you go inside the observatory, you can see what you're doing. It's not like a metal building where you go in and you can't see anything. The fact that they're corrugated, again, gives you a spot where you can have some convection, which is a good thing. And they do not, this material does not degrade in the sun. That's why they call them Suntuf. So you're going to get 8 to 10 years of use out of a roof built this way. So you can see I don't know if they're using Suntuf, but they're using something similar. It might even be metal. But I found that the white material works really, really well for a roof, and it discourages insects a lot. Okay, so there's roof up, roof down, boom, boom. So here's what you get. You end up with an interior space, nicely lit up, all of your toys around you, and your telescope's in it. Now you'll notice this person has not set up the telescope on a heavy-duty pier. He's found a way to perhaps have some concrete blocks or something. And you say, well, wait a minute, don't you want a permanent pier? And the answer is, yeah, that's nice, but you know, if you have to realign your telescope every month because of ground motion and changes versus putting in 2.5 tons of concrete into the ground, which one is easier? Which one is a simpler solution? So build for simplicity, let the light shine in. Walls, go for thin and light. You know, if you're worried about people breaking into your building, you know, now that we have these beautiful battery powered saws, you can't protect anything. If a thief wants to get into your house, they show up at your house with the DeWalt tool, and they go and cut a hole through the wall. Bingo. Save yourself the trouble. Go for a light building that cools rapidly. Pierre, you really don't need tons and tons of concrete. I'll show you my solution for my last observatory. Make the roof wider than the building so there's a lot of overhang. Then when it rains, the walls of the building don't get wet. And remember, when you build an observatory, nothing is forever. You're going to have to fix it. You're going to have to adapt it. You're going to have to change it. So don't necessarily try for the final solution. Try for a good solution that works. Keep it simple. Okay, so I'm going to talk briefly about my observatory. I'm sort of wrapping up now. This building was 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and I had 4-foot high walls because I lived out in the country and I didn't have to keep away my neighbor's lights. The building is 3 feet off the ground, and the building itself sits on only 4 posts. So the building, when you walk into it, it shaked and shimmied a little bit. The telescope sits on this pier. Now, I put a substantial blob of concrete in here, but then to build the pier up to the observatory, I just used cinder blocks and just mortar to hold them together. You say, well, cinder blocks are going to be weak, but cinder blocks are strong in compression and they're weak in tension. So I put the cinder blocks under tension. I put in some 1/2-inch diameter all thread, and I put a cap on the pier inside, and I just put like a ton of pressure on the cinder blocks, and they don't move a bit. So there's the cinder block pier. The building, the roof rolls off on that same kind of treads. This is the second roof, by the way. The first roof blew off in a violent windstorm. That's another story. And because I had alpacas in the pasture here, right under my observatory became their favorite place to roll in the dust. You know, you have to adapt. And then inside the observatory, it's very simple. The end things would open up to allow airflow. The building rolls off. This tarp is suspended here. Why? Because there were little leaks in the peak of the roof, and the telescope is here. Now you'll notice I also didn't have a fancy steel pier. You can build a really good pier out of plywood. 3/4-inch plywood glued and screwed together. It doesn't move anywhere near as much as people, oh, wood's weak. Wood is actually strong if you do it right. And so here I was observing last fall. This was in the XX Cygni campaign. This is a Roe Ackerman scope. And this little observing hutch on wheels, of course, when we weren't taking pictures, we never put it over here. The observing hutch with the computer would sit nice and far back. And of course, I didn't have a big white light in there. But it was a nice observatory because it kept you well protected. And at the same time, you had beautiful all sky access all the time. So with that, I will open it for questions and comments. And I will add, when you're building the observatory, think outside the box. You know, if you want to screw your observatory down on the ground, it turns out it's possible to do that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Berry. That was very informative. We've got quite a few questions which have already come in. So let's get started with a couple about the roof. So you mentioned the story with the storm blowing the roof off of that one observatory. We have a comment from Fabio Bradash, who said that he had provided his roof with counter rollers for that reason, and asked if you have any advice on protecting your observatory from wind to avoid that sort of situation.
My observatory, I put up a slide showing the observatory. I have 4 tie downs. These are used for securing a cargo on a trailer or something like that. So there's 4 of these things, and you can crank them down. I would just hang on these with my full weight. So each one of these things is rated to hold, I think, 500 pounds. So we have basically 2,000 pounds of hold down for the building, or for the roof. Then there's auxiliary things. Each of these things is rated for a ton or something like that, and those clamp onto structural parts of the roof. And if there's any wind forecast, I would put these auxiliary ones in. The other thing is that if a roof can roll and you have an 80-mile-an-hour wind, it will want to roll. So if there was a wind coming up, I would jack the roof up an inch or so, insert a piece of wood, and then the roof can't roll anymore. So yeah, you have to you have to be aware of what can happen. Now, if you check on the Facebook roll-off roof group, there's a pretty frequently discussions. There's various kinds of clips and devices you can put inside also. The other thing is, if you don't want to use the simple V-roller on a track, you can use garage door rollers, or, you know, there's a lot of hardware made for rolling things. I'm recommending these type things because they're very, very easy to use. If you have the ability to do welding or something like that, you can construct a system where the roller is captive in a track. And there's industrial systems that for doing that. So if you're in a place where there's a lot of wind, yeah, that's a design consideration, and you should think about it and look for something design. You know, garage door rollers are cheap and readily available everywhere.
Thank you very much. Also, on the topic of wind, we had at least one person say that they live in known hurricane territory. So, besides the roof, you've just mentioned some great considerations for the roof. Is there anything else when it comes to construction that you would want to change if you know that there's a decent chance that a hurricane will come through in the future?
Well, when you put a post into the ground, these posts are attached to 8-inch diameter, 3-foot deep concrete filling a sonotube. So there's more uses for sonotube than telescope tubes. So you know, that's likely that's a very simple kind of thing to do. If you have, if you're really worried about the building blowing away versus it simply getting moved over, you know, put in as much material, or, you know, put in the kind of foundation or the kind of base that is not going to move. But when I put these things in, I insert, you can get a metal bracket that goes into the concrete and then comes out of the ground, and it attaches to the wood. I used that kind because this is out in the pasture. If I have to abandon the building, which I'm going to have to do, you can cut this thing off at the ground level and take the post off, and all you have is something that's, you know, barely extends above ground. So somebody could run a mower across it and it wouldn't hit it. One of the reasons I used concrete blocks here is that I can take a sledgehammer and knock that whole pier out in about 20 minutes and then just cart away the blocks, leaving, again, a flat concrete surface that, you know, otherwise you're going to have to be out there with an excavator pulling 4 tons of concrete out of the ground. So,
that's a good point.
Yeah, remember, if you live in most places, you're probably going to have to get rid of your observatory when you sell the house. Okay. And the average American moves every 7 years. So your observatory, when you construct it, has a probable lifetime of about 7 years. So when you build it, consider what you're going to have to do to get rid of it. Unless you plan to live there forever.
Mhm.
And I built this because I knew that we would not be able to live on an 8-acre property forever. There's a lot of work maintaining a field and a fence out there.
Sure. Okay, thank you. And the person who had asked about being in a hurricane-prone area was John Stewart Taylor, and he's added a comment, which was that they use augers to tie things down, but are worried about 150-mile-per-hour winds and lots of rain that come with hurricanes. So he commented that. And yeah.
I'll just say, this looks like a joke, but they're not. These are came from a British guy who said they sell these things in the UK, and I suspect you can get them in the United States, and they're ground screws. And they come in with a machine and they screw these things into the ground, and you can see they go about 1 meter deep. So
Wow.
if you bolt onto that thing, your building will fall apart before the ground screws come out of the ground. And,
Wow.
and augering, yeah, there are, they make these spiral auger things that you can run into the ground too. Even my little roll-off building was held in place with you can get these helical metal screws that are designed for staking out large dogs. And that building was held down with 2 of those. So it wouldn't have held in 150-mile-an-hour wind. The building would have come apart, but
Right.
it did get through several 60-mile-an-hour winds intact.
That's good. And I think the chance when you live on like the Gulf Coast, the chance of being impacted by a hurricane is high, but the chance of experiencing the 150-mile-per-hour wind zone is fairly low. I'm just speaking from when I lived in Houston. So I'd say go ahead, build your observatory, plan for the fact that you might have to evacuate the equipment from it in the future, and that it might endure tropical storm force or, maybe 60, 70-mile-per-hour winds. But I don't know if you can design it for 150.
You can't. I mean, the building, no building built out of wood will withstand 150-mile-an-hour wind.
Mm-hmm.
So get a rider on your insurance policy. It says, if my observatory blows away, I'm covered.
Mm-hmm.
So it'll cost you something every year.
That's a lot of good advice there. We have one more question here about roofs, which comes from Jack Gillett, who had asked, which direction should you design the roof to roll off? To the north? Somewhere else?
Most people roll off to the north, but that depends on your trees. If you build your observatory in a place where you have a beautiful view of the western sky and the east has trees, you might as well send the roof off to the eastern side because you're not going to observe there anyway. So, use common sense. The roof can roll any direction you want it to. It's only because we observe less in the north that we normally roll the roof off to the north.
Right. Good answer. Okay, so we've got some questions more about weather conditions. One from Mark Harris, who has said that he lives in hot and humid Georgia in the United States South, and that it's frequently stays above, or it hits 100 degrees for most of the summer. And he wants to know will the heat damage if he has like an expensive mount and a refractor out in his observatory? And if so, what can he do to combat that? Can he install air conditioning? What would be your advice for that?
That gets, let me just show you the picture of this observatory again. This building, first of all, in Oregon, we would have 90 to 95-degree days, but humidity usually not much above like 60%. I lived in Virginia a couple summers, and so I know a more moderate version of hot and humid. Once again, you know, you want airflow. Now this white plastic material, you'll notice that the ends are not covered. I've got a fan here, and in hot weather, I can open this so that there's airflow all the time. So anytime there's a wind or a breeze, you're carrying hot air away out of the building. On a hot summer day, the interior temperature here would get up to about 7 and maybe as much as 10 degrees above ambient air temperature. So if the air is 95 degrees, the building might be 105 inside. If you put a metal shed under those same conditions, it'll get up to 140. So my experience was that my telescopes were never harmed in temperatures that would be as high as 100, 105. Temperature is probably less important than condensation. What you want to do is to avoid condensation. Just the simple heat usually won't damage material very much. I wouldn't leave, well, I managed to kill one computer with heating when we were doing the Eddington experiment in this little building over here. Where'd that go? Yeah, okay. This building had no ventilation in it. It was a temporary thing, got used for something else. This building could get hot and humid, and you would have heat, you would have moisture coming up out of the ground. And the problem was, yeah, we could get condensation on this telescope. And the trick was simply, after we'd used it, we'd leave one of the doors open for a couple hours and let the building dry out. I think in extreme conditions, you really have to learn what works for yourself. But I certainly would not build a hot black box with no air circulation. That won't work. I mean, we've all had a tool shed in the backyard that you couldn't go into because it was too hot.
Right. All right.
You want to do the opposite of what happens with that tool shed. You wanted the building light, thin, and lots of air.
Yeah, very good advice there. And just to add on to Mark's question about air conditioning, specifically, I'll just say as a single data point that at the Houston Astronomical Society site, where there were 20 or 30 personal observatories we all built in a little village, we did pretty much all of us have a like a window AC unit or something similar built into our observatories. But then we also weren't building with this light design, which I think honestly would have solved some of our problems there. So, but yes, in Houston, where we had similar conditions to Georgia, we were using ACs in our observatories.
Yeah, well, once you get into the second or third observatory that you're building, you're Remember, I'm talking about first observatories.
Mhm.
Your second building, and that's what your Houston group is.
Yes,
You're now building on years of experience that different people have had. Um, and you may have learned what works for your area. An insulated building with an air conditioner unit, but you're no longer talking simple.
that's
You're
correct.
starting to talk a lot of complexity into that.
That's correct. Mine was probably the simplest out there, and it was still very difficult to make. All right, so we're going to move on to some other questions now. There were some that came in about small observatories, like one from James Gage, who had asked, have you given any thought to a miniature observatory for example, just some camera optics on a small drive?
Absolutely. There you can build a 4-foot square box with a top that comes off. Um, yeah, take the same basic ideas and scale them down in size. I'm right now thinking about what I want to do to house an EV scope outside. Okay, you've seen, people know what the EV scopes are. Um, they're small. They don't need much, but they need some protection from, the neighbor's lights, for example, and the street
Mhm.
light that I now have in front of my house. So yeah, you want to, you know, a small camera mount, stuff like that. Build a structure. Again, you want to get it so there's no concrete sitting in there in the ground to hold heat and moisture, um, allow ample airflow, and uh, I think one thing I will say, prototype something like this, build it light, try it out. If it doesn't work, build again. The uh, I think I was fairly explicit in one of the slides. Nope, it was further back. Nothing is forever. Repair, adapt, change. If it doesn't work, tear it down and build another one. The price of your equipment usually exceeds let's put it this way, the price of your equipment probably exceeds the cost of building a small shed,
Mhm.
excepting nowadays when lumber has gotten so expensive.
True.
But it will go down again.
It will. Yes. All right. And then also in the theme of small observatories, we had a question about how small could you make a roll off observatory? So I assume where the whole observatory rolls off if you're planning on remote control only.
Um, I had an 18-inch telescope that was remote control only, in a roll-off structure that was 4 feet wide, 7 feet long, and 5 feet high. So, and that is in fact the little structure that we used for the Eddington experiment after the 18-inch telescope went away. You can, and my first picture that I showed, the A-frame building over the 6 and 8-inch telescopes, those were both close fits. So all you need is 2 or 3 inches clearance.
Okay.
However, I will add a significant, if you, well, no, if it's a roll-off building, you don't have a problem. I was thinking for mode of the observatory. If you have an observatory, you really want to be able to, for the telescope to point anywhere it can without encountering a wall or a ceiling.
Right.
Because you're working in, if you're running it remote, you can run into the walls or ceiling. You don't want to do that.
Right.
But as soon as you roll off the building, it's not going to hit anything.
Right. Right. Good advice. So our next question comes from Michael Gardner, who has asked, in the case of a roll-off building, have you ever stumbled over the roll-off rails at night?
Of course, you learn where they are, and uh, you just be careful. Now, when I showed that picture of the A-frame roll-off, we put my 12-inch telescope in that same roll-off. Now, because the 12-inch was bigger, we simply raised the rails so that the rails were 16 inches off the ground. Now you had a real stumbling problem, except that you could put a board across the rails, and that made it much easier to reach the eyepiece in a lot of positions. So the good came in with the bad. But yeah, you'll trip on them, and you can you can put in little red lights or something to remind yourself
Right.
not to walk too quickly in the dark.
Right. Maybe some of glow in the dark paint or tape or something.
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. All right. So we have a couple more questions that have come in about temperature. John Babb had asked, can you leave a computer out in your observatory if it's getting down to, say, 20 degrees below outside?
Um, you can buy computers that are temperature hardened, um, that are designed for this kind of environmental stuff. The guys that, oh geez, I can, um, the guys who run one of the small university observatories in Texas, can't think of, Ron DiUlio, they use small,
PD.
yeah, they use small computers that are designed for extreme temperatures. My laptop, um, I was like a little commuter. I would have my little briefcase and I'd have the laptop in it. I would carry it out in the evening and put it in the observatory. And in the morning, I would go home with my little laptop observatory in my little briefcase. So I did not leave that computer out there. The um, mini mainframe, or the mini, uh, the 16-inch high packaging for computers. I left that out in the little Eddington building, which would get very hot. It would get to 120 degrees maybe. And yeah, I succeeded in killing that computer. Um, so yeah, you can overheat them. Certainly not running. Off, look at the manufacturer specs to see what it says. It's safe to leave it when it's not on.
I think that's good advice. Look at the manufacturer specs. And speaking of high temperatures, the next question is from Miguel Carrion, who has said that he lives in Tucson, where it gets up to 115 degrees Fahrenheit. And he would like to know if it would be better in that situation to build an observatory with a concrete floor or a wood floor.
Um, I would, the concrete will heat up during the daytime and it will release heat slowly. It probably still makes sense. And I've never lived in that kind of situation. So local intelligence of what works may be best. But if you can have a wooden floor raised a foot or so or more off of the ground surface, you will have airflow underneath the building, and the building itself will not get hot or not, and it won't retain a lot of heat. Whereas the concrete will. Um, the other thing you will get from the concrete, I don't know how much problem you have with moisture coming out of the ground, but the ground is always a source of moisture, even in desert places.
Mhm.
And you really want to evaporate any water you can. Uh, and remember that when the building is closed, the coolest place in the building will be the floor. And
Right.
you can also get an, you know, let's put it this way. You could, you can build a light wooden building pretty cheap, and try it. And if it doesn't work, put down a concrete slab beside it and build another building. Um, should never think of your first build or your first observatory as the only building or the only observatory you'll ever build. Um, uh, be prepared. Be prepared to adapt and change your building. Um, and for the people who live in the Gulf Coast and other windy places, um, it was really catastrophic when the roof blew off on my building in the middle of the night in a raging rainstorm, and I was amazed how little damage it, occurred to the telescope from getting quite wet.
Mhm.
I just dried it out. It was okay.
That's good. Good. Okay, so uh, let's see. Okay, our next question is a pretty simple one. On the last slide, there was a roll-off top observatory. Do you have an approximate estimate of the cost to build an observatory like that?
Let's see, last slide. Oh, you mean this one, or was she talking about this one?
Presumably that one. Subhash, if this is not the observatory you're talking about, then please provide a clarification. But let's go ahead and assume that this is the right one.
Um, well, let's see. There's 6 4x4 posts, a bunch of 2x6 timbers. This would have been 3/8 construction plywood. Um, prices that were at the time, I probably put somewhere between $1,000 and $1,500 into this. I did a lot of other flaky stuff in this. You'll notice the building is inside out. The framing's on the outside and the smooth walls are on the inside. Um, so I was having a lot of fun with this design.
Mhm.
Um, when I did it, by the way, my plan originally was if it turns out that sunlight heated up the walls and made the building warm at night, that I would apply tilted panels that would have airflow through them. That turned out not to be necessary. But
Good.
that's why this building has smooth walls on the inside and framing on the outside. And notice we're not building 16 inches on center, which is the standard for framing walls. You know, I have a I have a framing every 48 inches.
Mhm.
Um, the problem when the big wind came up was the whole roof took off, flew 50 feet, and landed upside down here.
Yeah. Wow. Wow. All right. So I'm looking through the questions that we have already come in, trying to group
Oh,
them.
and I should be careful to note this I do not consider your first observatory.
Mhm.
As a first observatory, I would recommend something more like this. And I will add 8 by 12 feet is really feels spacious
Mhm.
if you have a small telescope. 8 by 8 feet, it's nice and tight and it's very cozy. And that is more like this structure. I mean, you can see I'm packed right in there. There's no space for anything but me and the computer.
Okay. Good to know. Thanks. So I think the next most relevant question would be one from Elliot Benella, who has asked if you have any thoughts on a solar station or observatory. So for solar observation, not solar powered. Would it be the same kind of stuff here?
That's a really, really good question. I would, if I were him and I was trying to build an observatory for solar work only, I would try to get in touch with other observers and find out what they've done. Because we're talking about a totally different regime of heat and airflow and so forth.
True.
I would guess, again, lightweight, no heat retaining materials, and lots of airflow around them. Now, the professional astronomers have done a fair amount about this with things like Big Bear Solar Observatory, which they put in a lake. And that was to get good seeing, to avoid the landscape around the building getting warm and creating turbulence. And they found that the Big Bear Lake was actually pretty effective. And people seem to paint all the stuff in and around solar telescopes with white paint. And it's not just white paint, it's titanium white paint, which is highly reflective in the infrared. But you know, your best ground truth is to check with people who have built and used solar observatories before.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I imagine they'd probably have some advice too for building in somewhere shady for yourself. At least in Houston, that would be a big concern.
Yeah, and they can also tell you what doesn't work if they get a moment of honesty. They'll
Yes.
say, yeah, I put my observatory in the middle of a nice asphalt parking lot and it was terrible.
Yeah. All right. Speaking of painting the insides of observatories, we had a question from Michael Poxon, or actually, it's more of a comment, who had said that from a variable star viewpoint, he thinks it's important to paint the inside of an observatory matte black. Do you have any thing to add to that comment? Would you say that that's important?
Um, yeah, you want the observatory walls to be a place that when you look away from the eyepiece, and I'm assuming we're talking visual observing here, or maybe it's um, but you want a place where your eyes can rest. Um, if you, let's see, my observatory, snap back here. I did not paint my walls black. And you'll see even that I have a very, very dim
Mhm.
light. This is those rope lights, and they were on a dimmer and would shine down and just light up a little section of the floor. That was very useful because I did not bump into the walls when I stood up,
Mhm.
because I could see where the walls were. This is a dark sky site pretty much, so I didn't run into problems with uh, the inside of the observatory being bright. Um, Certainly the classic dome observatory, they painted them black, um,
Mhm.
because you're always looking up and your sky is then the brightest thing your eyes are looking at.
Yeah, good strategy there. Okay.
Oh, and if you have a public observatory, use white paint in places where people bump into stuff.
Right.
So in a place like this, you can paint the floor black or dark gray, but be sure to put like a foot wide stripe of white so that a well-adapted person knows where the things they can stumble on are.
Yeah, good, very good point there. I've been to some observatories that use like a bright yellow tape and put markers on the edge of their
Exactly.
floor and
Yeah.
stuff like that. Yeah.
Yeah. when the public is coming in, you have a different safety issue.
Right. Right. Okay, and another comment here about observatory design came from Bob Buckheim, who had uh, commented when you were talking about you want to keep your uh, floor of your observatory raised up off of the ground. He said that one other nice thing about having a raised floor is that you can access the underneath of the floor to run cables. And if you later need to run another cable, you can just drill some new holes in the floor. It's not a major surgery.
That's a good point, and I certainly did a lot of that. You just get underneath there with a 1/2 inch drill, and
Mhm.
you run new holes through the structure. The other thing which is useful, when I went up 3 feet, one of the major reasons I went as high as 3 feet is this is too high for critters.
Mhm.
Um, Low observatories, if you're a foot off the ground, the mice come right up and into the building, and squirrels and stuff like that. I did not have a problem with squirrels and mice in this building. It was only when I had not been using it for months after our wildfire that I discovered that there were nuts and seeds and stuff being consumed and piled in one corner.
Mm.
But
Yeah.
while I was using it actively, I kept the animals away. The little roll-off shelter that was on the ground, the animals loved that.
Mm.
It had a resident population of mice and squirrels.
Not good.
As soon as you're off the ground, they're not comfortable with it. And again, insects don't like light. Insects like dark places they can hide.
True.
And oh yeah, you will have some species of wasps will build nests and stuff like that. Um, in Oregon, the species who built nests built these little hanging paper nests, and um, they were very, very non-aggressive, happy little wasps if you left them alone. If you
Mhm.
accidentally put your hand down on the nest, it was problems.
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
swarm out, they'd be after you. But I only had one problem with that once, and never did again.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
You keep looking underneath things. Are they building a nest in there?
Yeah. We have those wasps where I am as well, so I'm always looking underneath things as well. Fortunately, I haven't put my hand into a nest yet. Now, we've got some questions about things which I notice are visible in this photo. So let's go ahead and move on to those. Mark Harris had asked, what, in your opinion, is the best and cheap way of building a laptop hutch?
Um, well, mine is built out of 2x4s and plywood. Um, so this is a little, it's 24 inches square or something very similar to that. It's the standard desk height, which I think is 28 inches off the ground, and it has rollers on it. Otherwise, it's just there's a space underneath where I have a box where I keep bits and pieces. And then the top of this, I built this out of this cover part out of this 1/8 inch thick material. Um, and honestly, I wish I'd built it 2 inches higher because I had to look hunched down
Hmm.
to see the whole screen. The cloth in the front drops down over here so that when I'm not using the laptop, I just drop the cloth over it and it blocks all the
Hmm.
light coming out. And um, I had a little uh, LED lights that could be set to different colors, and I found a kind of a medium orange was gave me the best visibility. And then this particular laptop was a gaming laptop, and you could turn the screen brightness down way, way low. Um, so, uh, and it's since my observatory survived the fire, I'm using the this little rolling computer desk again out there beside the EV scope.
Very nice. Okay, and our next question here is about isolating the telescope and the mount from the building, whether on a pier or a tripod. Can you give some tips and generally discuss that?
Okay, well, in this picture, you can see they simply don't touch.
Mhm.
I left a 1-inch wide gap, and when I built it, and over about 10 years, the gap decreased to a 1/2 inch in the front and maybe 1¼ inches on the side. So the building and the pier both moved a tiny amount. The biggest problem I had was you drop something and it magnetically and magically looks for this hole to fall
Yeah.
into. Um, um, let's see, if you're concerned with stuff getting in here, you can use tape or cloth or anything to prevent stuff from falling through that provides no strength in shear,
Mhm.
so that this slides or flexes.
Okay.
Let's see, if you're just setting up a tripod in a building like this, it's easier to avoid a tripod because then you have 3 places you have to have a hole in the floor in some fashion.
Mhm.
Um, uh, and you can see what I did. I got rid of the tripod and I just made this what I call a lion tamer stand. It's just a trapezoidal structure with interior reinforcing. It's 3/4 inch plywood. And these uh, trapezoidal lion tamer stand type structures are incredibly rigid. And then there's this is the top of the block up here, and the uh, bolts that hold this thing down. Um, so they're pulling down with like 1,000 pounds, you know. And then this pier is also tied to that. So the pier is held down. If I stumble into this pier and stuff, it doesn't knock the pier over, it bruises my ankle.
That's all very good design info. Thank you. So let's see. It looks like we've got some more large scale questions. So first of all, when it comes to light pollution, if someone's living in like a light polluted city, would you still encourage them to go on and build an observatory, or would you say it's not worth it?
It is, I would say it's worth it, because it means that you can go out and be observing quickly. The other thing is, if you're observing variable stars, the visibility of stars is much less affected by light pollution than the visibility of galaxies and faint deep sky objects.
Mhm.
So yeah, in a bright spot you might lose several magnitudes due to the light pollution. But because you can, in an observatory type situation, you can be comfortable, you can be isolated because all your tools are there, convenient. You can be more productive in an observatory type setting. Um, and when I lived in downtown Toronto, Ontario, which we lived, my observatory at the time was actually an observing site. This would go way back. this little telescope here, I kept on the roof of our second floor building. It had a flat roof. It was a duplex, and there was a brick wall down the middle of the building that was very stable. It divided the two half houses from one another. This was on the roof of the building overlooking the Bathurst subway station, which was 2 floors below. And the biggest problem I was encountering in terms of planetary observing, which was what I was doing in the time, was that when the streetcars would go around the corner and turn, they would shake the ground and my planetary images would shake. So I had an 8-inch Del Kirkham on the telescope at the time, or on the mount at the time. But aside from the fact that the landlord would have not put up with my building a roll-off building or a observatory on the roof of the building, it would have made me infinitely more productive up there if I'd been able to do that. Because then I wouldn't have been able to see the all the surrounding infrastructure. I would have only been able to look up into the sky.
Yeah, I think that's some very good advice that you've got there. And I agree that, if you're in the city, there's still a whole lot of variable star stuff that you can do. Because like you said, they're not as affected by light pollution as the galaxies and the nebulae are.
Yeah, and if you're doing imaging, now you're just counting photons, and so you have more noise photons from the sky. But your ability to record faint stars or to work down, with a camera, if you can't reach 16th magnitude easily, even in a bright sky, there's just a lot of work you can do. And if you're doing spectroscopy, especially with a slit spectroscope, the light pollution's not there.
You can just subtract it.
Hey, you just subtract it, and professional astronomers, they do their spectroscopic work when the moon is out.
Right. They can work very close to the moon too.
Yeah.
All right. So next up, we have a question from Fabio Bradash, who has asked if you're using a roll-off observatory, would it be a good idea to cover the telescope and the mount with some sort of plastic cover to protect from dust, or would these increase the humidity too much?
They will definitely increase the humidity. The solution I found was to get a lightweight, basically it was a baby blanket kind of material. It would let air flow through it, but dust tended not to go through it. So I would just throw this light baby blanket over the telescope. And that's the telescope in the picture. Okay, so it was covered with this baby blanket. And the telescope would dry off because moisture would go right out through the baby blanket material. But because I was in a pasture where, there was hay growing, we had a lot of pollen, and we had a lot of ag dust, this dust that just hangs around in places where they do agriculture. That did not come through. So I would take the baby blanket out once in a while, shake it out vigorously and get the dust out of it. And, when it got, too much dirty, you take it in and you wash it in the washing machine. So, use something that moisture passes through, but objects like dust and pollen and stuff will not.
That's a very good point right there.
Yeah. Go to the cloth store and tell them tell them you're looking for something where you want moisture to be able to get through, and for something you can cover will stay dry. And they know their cloth there. And I mean, even the cheapest, cotton uh, yard goods type stuff would probably do a pretty decent job. And stuff comes in 54-inch wide stuff. So buy 3 yards of it, throw it on and see what it does. But
Thank you.
plastic is horrible.
Yeah.
Moisture does not go through it. Your telescope will be the coldest thing when the building warms up and the moisture and the humidity rises, and your telescope will be the water magnet in the building.
Yeah, I've experienced that because my own scope cover is completely impermeable to water. So when it's been a dewy night or whatever, you put the cover on and you're just sealing the water in. So I'm probably now going to go out and find some permeable fabric like you mentioned. So thank you for that tip.
Mhm.
Now, just a couple more questions left. We're starting to get towards the end. Okay, so talking more about telescope care inside of an observatory. Do you recommend using mothballs to dissuade mice and or setting up a warm light bulb to help cut down on moisture when not in use?
Both of those are pretty effective. Especially if you've got like an impermeable thing, you can put a light bulb underneath to warm the telescope up slightly. And it'll keep it above the dew point if you do have temperature swings. The permeable cover I found was better than that. That's when I was using less. I was using tarps. Um, it was because I was using the light bulb that I had to that I started looking for a better solution. Mothballs work well for skunks. I do not know well how well they work for mice. So I certainly try it, but don't just throw them on the ground. Okay, put them in a container or something so that if the smell is driving you crazy, you can take them away again.
Mm-hmm. Good point. We had a comment come in while you were speaking from Michael Poxon, who said that in terms of putting some sort of warm source in there to keep the moisture down, he uses a low wattage greenhouse heater, which in his case provides just enough heat. So there's a
You're looking
recommendation there.
10, 15, 20 watts of power, something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so our next question had come from Sugamar Iyer. I apologize if I mispronounced your name, who had asked earlier when you were speaking about something, he'd asked the question, can we have a similar structure on the rooftop with proper grouting? And then I asked for clarification about what the structure was because I forgot what was being spoken about. And he said he was talking about the building's pillars. So I don't know if you're able to provide an answer to that about having those on top with proper grouting.
I think he's talking about water leaks in the roof.
Okay.
I'm just guessing that, but at this point, you're doing something specialized enough. You should probably talk to somebody who's familiar with building real buildings, because there's a lot of know-how about how to build normal buildings. And we're talking about a temporary building in most of these cases where the normal building codes and the normal laws of what you're required to do are different. So I would, if you're talking about stability on the top of a building, buildings bounce and wiggle quite a bit. When let's see, the roof of the physics building at oh, they set up a telescope on the roof of a physics building and discovered that the building bounced and jiggled like crazy. It was, but it didn't bounce and jiggle like crazy everywhere. So if you put the telescope down in a lot of different places, you eventually found a spot where there must have been, um, you know, underlying structures in the building that were solid. Don't put it near an elevator shaft. They you, you have an attack of the wiggles every time someone comes up the elevator. Or
So on that topic of building on the roof of building, we had someone who asked specifically about that, or at least on a terrace. It was Firat Singi, who said that his office is on the fourth floor of a building with a large terrace, and that he could build a roll-off shed over a pier. And he would like to hear your opinion on any disadvantages over being on the ground.
the advantage is probably in usability.
Mm,
Um, if it's a place that you can get to um, readily and you have security from other people or possible theft or interference with it, um, I'd certainly put it on the patio or a structure where it works. Um, we as astronomers, we sometimes worry too much about um, shakiness and stability of the telescope. The telescope can wiggle. If you're visually observing, you've already, um, well, your eye can follow the motion of the telescope unless it's shaking like crazy. Any AVSO observer, um, from the olden days who used a pipe mount or one of those things, all those old telescopes were shaky as all get out.
mhm,
Um, if you're in the modern digital age, um, you'd like the telescope not to shake and wiggle. Um, so you're going to, and the best way to find out, if any particular place is shaky is to set up a telescope and do star trails or something and see whether or not they wiggle.
mhm,
Um, but it depends so much on the circumstances there of the individual spot. So I don't think there's any one rule. You have to adapt. Um, like I said here in the end, think outside the box. But first thing you have to do is you have to understand the box. Okay,
mhm,
what is the box you're in when you're thinking about building on top of a roof? Why would you want to put it there? What are the advantages? There's nothing magic about the ground,
mhm. Good.
aside from the fact that most of us have a lot of it.
True.
Many of us have a lot of it.
Good advice. Thanks.
And
Okay.
there are a lot of people who in tall buildings who observe on balconies, on the side of the building, and they only have one side of the sky available.
Mhm. I've done that myself actually, and I found usually this is something that you'll want to try before you build your terrace observatory. Usually it would be quite steady while I was looking through the eyepiece, but then if someone else were to come out on the balcony and start walking around, my field was suddenly jumping all over the place because the balcony itself would flex. So if you think there's going to be foot traffic across your terrace, make sure that you set up your telescope ahead of time, like Mr. Berry was saying, and do some tests and just see, are you fine with the vibration conditions there?
And
Okay.
and and you're always, I mean, you're always telling other people, stop walking around.
Yes. Yes. Okay. We've got two more questions about the large scale design of an observatory. Uh, one came from Sugamar Iyer, who asked, why do people put revolving domes on top of their observatories? He says he was asked to help in fabricating a dome with wheels. Does that structure help? What are its advantages?
The reason I didn't talk about domes is that they are not simple to build, and that's the only reason. I've never built a dome myself, but I've certainly observed in domes, and if you're observing visually, it's especially if you're not looking at one part of the sky for hours and hours and hours, you're always moving the darn dome around so you can look at it. You run into the annoying problems of, oh, we're down low, we have to bring the dome down, latch it on, lift it up so you've got a view out. Gee, I wonder why the star is getting dimmer. Oh, forgot to rotate the dome, and the telescope is slowly moving into the dome. Any heat sources in the dome itself, that air has to go out somewhere. If you've ever done a public star night in a dome, and before the people arrive, you're looking at Jupiter and it looks beautiful, and you can almost see the disks of satellites. 7, 8, 9, 10 people crowd into the dome, and all of a sudden the seeing goes totally horrible. That's because at 200 watts per person, you're suddenly 1400 watts of power being dissipated in there, heating the air, and all that flows out to the optical path you're looking through. On the other hand, the dome can provide you with lots of protection from the wind. You're only looking at a small part of the sky, so you tend to be well dark adapted inside of a dome. And there's a psychological thing. Hey, a dome is a real observatory. Okay, it's got but here's the thing. Look at the dome structures or telescope shelters that professional astronomers are building nowadays. They are not classic domes. They don't look like the 200-inch dome. They look at the Gemini telescopes with their openings all around. Look at the square box things with the biparting shutters. There's a lot to learn from what the professional astronomers are doing, because they're doing things like wind tunnel studies of how air flows in and out of the observatory building. They spent millions of dollars on this. We might as well learn what we can, and that is, we do not want warm air piling up inside the dome and spilling out through the slot. At York University, where the 24-inch telescope is, and people remember that from a couple of years ago when the annual meeting of the AAVSO was held there. I did my master's work on that telescope, and it was the worst case of warm air spilling out of a dome slot I've ever seen. It was never good. And they built it, they put the dome on the north side of the building so that we always looking across the heating and ventilation systems.
Oh no.
No, that's what happens when the physicists build an observatory.
Yeah, true. You were mentioning how we can learn from professional observatory design. I think it's worth mentioning that the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, one of the most revolutionary and prolific telescopes of all time, is housed in a roll-off shed, effectively. They just roll the whole building away, just like these small observatories do. And that works very well for them on the professional scale.
And you'll also notice that they are not on the ground. They are suspended well above the ground.
Yes, true.
that telescope is built with airflow in mind,
Exactly.
and reaching ambient temperature, and the tube is is ventilated very thoroughly. It
Yes.
looks kind of solid, but air goes right through it.
Yeah, that's baffling.
So that's an excellent, that whole telescope, or that whole observatory is a lesson, and is full of lessons that amateurs can look at and understand.
Absolutely. Okay, so it looks like our last question for now, unless anyone else sends one in shortly, comes from Jack Gillett, who has asked about making an observatory by reworking a prefabricated plastic storage shed. Do you have any opinions on doing that?
Um, it's if you can, figure out ways to allow ample ventilation in the structure, you can do that. Your biggest problem is probably that the roof is going to be opaque, and the building will get hot in the daytime. So you need to counter that. Um, it may be that you'll have to put in ventilation. You may want to install a fan, especially a temperature controlled fan, so that if the temperature goes above like 80 Fahrenheit, the fan comes on and cools the building. Um, and I, you also want to make sure you're not putting a plastic building down directly on dirt. You really want to have a platform or something to get it off of the dirt and to allow airflow underneath. Otherwise, the building will get damp inside. Other than that, if the building allows you to detach the roof and allow it to roll back, it's probably a pretty inexpensive way to go. Um, I did look at, I have looked at those kind of things at Lowe's, um, scratching my head and thinking, now, how could I use that? Because I'm now in the situation of needing to build a new observatory. And I think still uh, building in wood and the methods that I've been talking about today is probably a better way to go, but it might not be for you and your circumstances.
Okay, thank you. Uh, we actually did have one last question come in while you were speaking from Jay Miller, who asked about when you're putting in a pier for an observatory with a pier, how deep should you put the concrete?
below the frost level.
Okay.
Okay. In places that get really cold in the winter, that may be 18 inches to 2 feet. In places like Oregon, I don't know, it's something like 14 inches or something in most spots. Um, you definitely don't want frost heaving. Um, on the other hand, you do not have to put 2 tons of concrete, or 2 tons of concrete 7 feet down to accomplish a steady pier.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so uh, think of it this way. Would you rather put a ton of concrete in the ground that's that's below frost, so it's not going to have frost heaves, um, or put like 3 times as much deeper, and um, not, I have it backwards. Okay. If you do a relatively lightweight, not a deep enough pier, you might find yourself once a year having to tweak the polar alignment. Whereas if you put in the massive 5-ton pier, you might not have to tweak the polar alignment but once every 2 or 3 years. you're going to want to polar align your scope from time to time anyway, just to check it out. So do it adequately, but you don't have to overdo it. This is actually interesting because it was a discussion in one of the Facebook amateur discussions, and many of the people were building really massive piers. And you can't go wrong by building a pier which is much more massive than necessary. The question is, how lightweight can you be? How simple can you be and get adequate performance? And the real rule is get it below the frost line.
Okay. That's really good advice, something that I did not know. All right.
And there's places like in Texas where you have this funny soil that contracts and stuff with moisture changes, where the ground heaves and changes. So again, pay attention to your local conditions.
Yes, that seems to be a reoccurring theme, is pay attention to your local conditions and ask your local observatory builders. All right, and that looks like that's it as far as the questions go. So I'm going to go ahead and wrap things up here. And the first thing I would like to do to wrap things up is to extend one huge thank you to you, Mr. Berry, for sharing your time and knowledge with us today. It's been absolutely lovely. And I see that we've had quite a few comments come in through the Q&A box saying as much from our attendees. Now I'm going to go ahead and put up a end card here. There we go. Okay, I would also like to, before we wrap things up, I would like to thank again our sponsors, DC3 Dreams and Voice Astro. DC3 Dreams provides high-end observatory automation and web-based multi-user remote imaging. The AAVSO Net Observatories use DC3 Dreams ACP Expert for the Bright Star monitors and other programs. The AAVSO Photometric All Sky Survey Project, also known as APAS, has used ACP Expert's AI scheduler to automatically acquire over 500,000 star fields, hands-off, at a rate of 1,000 square degrees per night. This has resulted in photometry for over 128 million objects in about 99% of the sky. The Boyce Research Initiative and Education Foundation provides online astronomy education, observatory resources, and research experiences to students, student teams, and schools in order to learn how to perform observations, conduct research, and publish their results in scientific journals, such as the Journal of the AAVSO. Today's How-To Hour has been recorded, and the recording will soon be made available for free on the AAVSO's YouTube channel, where you can find a full library of webinars just like these. Go check it out, and while you're there, consider subscribing to our channel. Not only will you be notified each time a new educational video is posted, but by hitting that little subscribe button, you will be increasing the AAVSO's educational reach, making YouTube that much more likely to suggest our videos to others. This is just one more way that you can help support the AAVSO. Speaking of support, this webinar is being supported by you, the viewer. So please, if you're not a member, join the AAVSO. AAVSO membership comes with a wide array of benefits, including free access to our mentorship program. If you would like to get started observing variable stars, but you're not quite sure where to start, our mentors can help. And as always, we would be so grateful if you would consider donating to the AAVSO. Every donation matters and goes towards making programs like this one come to life. One more thing before you go. After you leave this webinar, you will be automatically directed to a brand new and shiny survey. That's right, we have updated our post-webinar survey. So even more than ever, we would really appreciate it if you would fill it out. Even if you've already filled out a survey at a different webinar in the past, you are welcome to fill out this one. We will read every single response, as we do for all the past surveys, and we take into account all of the submitted feedback when we are making the plans that will shape the future of this webinar series. Please note that the survey is anonymous, so if you use the survey to ask any questions that you want to receive a reply about, make sure that you write down your email address in the text box at the bottom so we know who to send our reply to. Finally, I would like to extend one last huge thank you to Mr. Barry from all of us here at the AAVSO. We appreciate you.
And we can continue discussion of observatories and so forth in the equipment and instrumentation section. So, you know, if you got more questions, post them there, and we can take care of that. And we can get more pictures from other people who have built observatories. Again, look at what lots of people have done and learn from what other people have done and steal their best ideas.
Absolutely. That's good advice. Be sure to go to the AAVSO's website to find those observing section forums and get your advice. Thank you very much.